Hello and thank you for being here. I am Perry Vincenzo, a PhD student at the University of Zurich, and in this talk I'm going to tell you about HOTVis, a new visualization method that extends force-directed layout so that they can represent time-respecting paths. So let's take a look at what are time-respecting paths. Well, if we take a sequence of interactions between nodes, that is a temporal network, well, we can project it on the nodes and obtain a network. However, we can also take a deeper look and take a look at the consecutive and adjacent time-stamped edges and get paths, time-respecting paths out of it. Like in this example, we get those 4 paths that tell us that we can reach E and D from both A and B. However, if we just switch 2 of those time-stamped edges, we see that we still have the same edges, so the same topology for this network, but the time-respecting paths that we get are different. We only get 2 of them, and we now see that we can no longer go from A to D or from B to E. And in this situation, in this example, it was very easy to just visualize those patterns using arrows, but what about larger graphs? Are we still able to do that in larger graphs? Well, this is a larger graph made of 30 nodes. It has a k-regular topology with k equal to 10, so a very uniform one, but you can see that the nodes are colored. That's because we created a temporal network out of that, in which we implanted a pattern which works so that if a path starts from a node with a given color, then in 2 steps it is very likely that that path will be into one of the other nodes in that community, in that same group with that same color. So now that you know the pattern, you can try to see if you can detect it in this animation, where animations are one of the popular methods to visualize temporal networks. So despite knowing what the pattern was, it was probably very hard to detect it. But so how can we detect those patterns? Well, we can take a look at the mathematical models that are used to detect them, as for example, higher order network models. In higher order network models, we can take those sequences of interactions and instead of projecting them on the nodes, we can project them on what are called higher order nodes. Well, higher order nodes are nodes that are made of sequences of nodes. In this example, you can see that the sequences are of length 2, but this is not a limitation because we can also define them for sequences of any length. Well, if we take those sequences that we have in those temporal networks and project them on these higher order nodes, we see that in one case we get the following topology, which is a connected topology, and in the other one, after the switching of the edges, we get this other topology which has 2 components, which also informs us of the fact that we now can no longer go from A to D or from B to E. So now we have a way to incorporate those patterns into a model, but what we wanted to do was, of course, to visualize that pattern. And one trivial solution could be to just use, for example, a force-directed layout on the higher order network. But as you can see here on the right, on the blue nodes, those nodes are not the ones that we are interested in. What we want is to see those patterns in a layout that uses the usual nodes that we have. So the nodes that you have here on the left, the red nodes. But what we can do is to somehow mix those layouts, so we can take the forces from the higher order networks and we can project them on the first order. So if we do that, well, we can get a new starting point for a force-directed layout, which gives us a new layout which also takes into account the information from the higher order networks. And now we display that for a network, for just a higher order network of the second order, but this can be generalized to order of any value. So what happens if we use this method, if we use HOTVis on the synthetic network that we outlined previously? Well, we go from this non-informative layout to this other layout, which clearly outlines the groups you had implanted in the network. So we now know that HOTVis works on a synthetic example, but what about empirical networks? Can we use HOTVis for empirical networks? Well, to test that, we create a new set of measures that quantifies the representation of temporal patterns in a layout. Well, those measures are causal path dispersion, which captures whether vertices that can influence each other are positioned in close proximity. And you can notice that this is the same property that we had in the synthetic networks, in which we could recover the group structure, while the other one is closeness eccentricity. Closeness eccentricity is inspired by the observation that in force-directed layouts, the nodes with high values of closeness centrality are placed closer to the barycenter of the visualization. Well, in this situation, we define an extension of the closeness centrality, which is a temporal closeness centrality, and we test if with HOTVis we have that nodes with higher temporal closeness are also placed closer to the barycenter of the visualization. We also use the following testing procedure. We make 100 cross-validation experiments on 5 empirical datasets, where we make like 100 experiments on each dataset for each order that we test. So we use the training set to run HOTVis at different maximum order k, and we use the test set to compute the causal path dispersion and closeness eccentricity so that we have a way to assess the quality and the consistency of the identified temporal patterns. And also we compute the number of edge crossing so that we can also assess how clearly the static topology is still represented in the layout. So these are the results for closeness eccentricity, where we see that with higher value of k for HOTVis, the nodes with higher temporal closeness centrality are placed closer to the barycenter of the visualization. This also tells us that HOTVis can represent the temporal closeness of vertices better than a first-order layout. To further test this property, we also define a binary classification problem where we use vertex position computed from the training set to predict the vertices with high temporal closeness in the test set. So we predict a vertex to be among the top 10% with higher temporal closeness if it is among the top 10% with smallest distance from the barycenter. And we evaluate this binary classification using ROC curves, and we see that for k larger than 1, HOTVis outperforms a first-order visualization. So now we can see this is like a first-order layout, this is a static layout of one network, and we are showing here exactly the property that I just described. So this is a network of passenger itineraries between US airports, and the circle that you can see highlights the area that contains the top 10% vertices with the smallest distance from the barycenter. While the nodes in red that are highlighted in red are the nodes that are in the top 10% for values of temporal closeness centrality. Now, in this visualization that you see now, which is a first-order visualization, the majority of the red nodes, so of the nodes with high values of temporal closeness centrality, are outside the circle, while in this visualization, which is obtained using HOTVis at the second order, you can see that the majority of the red nodes are within the circle. So now let's look at the results for causal path dispersion, where we see that for a suitably chosen maximum order k, we have that large decreases in causal path dispersion go together with mild increases in edge crossing, which tells us that nodes that can influence each other are actually placed closer without massively disrupting the topology of the network. So in this other example, we see instead now a first order standard force-directed layout representation of a network of social interactions between children in a primary school. In the visualization, the node colors represent the classes of each student, while the square markers identify the teachers. Well, you can see that in this representation in the first order, using a standard force-directed layout, the students of different classes are placed in the same group. They're all together. While if we take a look at this representation, which is the representation that uses HOTVis at the second order, we can see that this layout highlights the ground truth grouping of the students into classes, which also demonstrates that with the visualization of the temporal clusters that we saw on this synthetic example also holds in empirical networks. In conclusion, we introduce a simple and intuitive algorithm that visualizes time-respecting paths in temporal networks. We demonstrate our approach retrieving temporal communities from a synthetic dataset. We define new measures to quantitatively assess the performance of the method, and we use the aforementioned measures to demonstrate the effectiveness on empirical data. Thank you for your attention, and if you want additional information, you will be able to find them in the description to this video. Thank you again.